Welcome to Not Another PD, the podcast for helping professionals who are over dull trainings and death by slideshow workshops. I'm Jasmine Purcell, social worker, coach, supervisor, and self-proclaimed boundaries queen. Each week, you'll hear real, honest conversations, sometimes solo, sometimes with expert guests. Think insider perspectives, practical takeaways, and a focus on your well-being, not just how you show up for clients. This podcast is about you, the human behind the caseload, the human behind the profession. So, what are we waiting for? Let's get started. Episode 8. Welcome back. In this episode, I'm continuing on the career theme that we'd started in episode 7. So episode 7 was focusing around 3 career mindset shifts that you can start making today so you can sort of move forward in your career as a helping professional. So if that sounds like an interesting episode, go back and listen to that one. But I won't rehash on that episode because now we're talking about something that's such a huge passion of mine, and it's something I've spoken about a lot, both with supervisees and in my coaching, but also in my program Beyond the Caseload. So this is so important. It needs its own episode. And what we're talking about in this episode is our identity beyond our professional titles. In particular, how we as helping professionals can sometimes have the tendency to over-identify with our professional roles. So whether you're a social worker, a counsellor, psychologist, coach, any sort of form of helping professional, we come in so many different shapes and sizes, but whatever role you have, sometimes we have a tendency to over-identify with that role, and then that becomes all-consuming. That's what we're talking about today. And I remember there was a time when I was at one of my best friend's baby showers, and I was, I think, one of the few people that didn't know anyone or many people at all at this event. And going into the event, I felt particularly shy and nervous. And despite the fact that I have a podcast now and I'm speaking on camera, I sometimes get quite nervous and I can be quite reserved in social settings where I don't know anybody. I think even in professional settings, if I go to a professional networking event and I don't know anyone, I can also feel at times not super confident. And because I didn't really know anyone there, as to be expected, the whole afternoon was filled with introductions. And there were quite a few people who introduced themselves to me, and I'd introduced myself and at the time it didn't seem that there was anything wrong with the way I was introducing myself. And without being asked what my profession is, what I do for a job, I was finding myself introducing myself as, I'm Jasmine, I'm a social worker. And at the time, it just sort of came naturally to me, just, rolled right off the tongue. And I guess, part of it was because maybe I was nervous, I wasn't sure what to say. And also, I am proud to be a social worker, and I'm proud of my qualification and all the work I put into getting it. And it's such a, impact-driven profession. And whatever your profession is, lovely listener, your profession's also driven by the impact that you can make on other people's lives, the lives of those around you. So I'm, always been proud of my role. And now, many years later, when I reflect on that, I realize that that's not the sole or core part of my identity. Being a social worker isn't the core part of my identity. The main part of my identity is, and we all have so many different parts of our identity, so this isn't, going to go into all of those different parts. But for me, the core part of my identity is that I identify strongly as being a female, being a wife, mother, sister, auntie, and friend. So I identify with these titles. So there's so many different parts to all of our identities, but our professional title isn't and should never be the core part of our identity. Yes, it can be definitely very values driven. So I'm very aligned to a lot of values around in human rights and supporting others, and these parts of my own personal values also align with my professional values, yes, but our professional titles shouldn't be all consuming. And now that I've done a lot of work at actually looking at, well, who am I outside of my professional title? Now, I'm pleased to say, in a social setting, even if I'm super nervous and uncomfortable, I'll introduce myself not by my professional title. So now how I introduce myself is I'll say, hi, I'm Jasmine. Yeah, I met Millie. We were colleagues and I'm a mum of 2 girls. And then I might talk about, something else I'm interested in and then ask them something similar about themselves. So once we acknowledge that our professional title is just one part of our identity, it's definitely freeing, and it can also have less power over us. Sometimes we over-identify with our professional titles to the detriment of our own, personal identity, our own well-being. So that's when it actually becomes an issue. That's why it's so important to talk about it. And there are 3 main types of professionals who can over-identify with their professional titles, and you may fit into all 3 of these categories. You may kind of move between all of them. This may have been you previously, but now you don't find that you over-identify with your professional title. I myself have fit into all of these types at one point or another, so I can say that I haven't always had this perfect, haven't always had this down pat. I would like to share what I've learned so far with all of you. So who are we actually when we remove the professional title? So when I strip back that I'm a social worker, who am I actually underneath that professional title? So there's 3 main ways that professionals can over-identify with our professional titles. The first one is the always worker. This can look like not having any distinct boundaries that separate your personal and your professional life. It could be that you are always the one to volunteer to stay back late at work, to take that extra referral. Maybe you're someone who consistently comes in early as well, and you're just an over-giver. You're over-delivering, you're over-servicing, you're just always working. You may take unfinished work home on weekends. You may be unwell, but you're still working when you're on sick leave. You may actually be forced to take leave. You struggle to actually switch off from your professional role. So that one's the always working or the always worker. The second one is the storyteller. And I have been so guilty of this one in the past. So the storyteller is someone who tends to always talk about work when you're off the clock. So whether it's you go for Friday night drinks with your colleagues, you catch up with your colleagues or your friends who work in similar industries or aligned industries to yourself, and you find yourselves in social settings outside of work hours. In other words, when you're not being paid to talk about work or think about work, you find yourself defaulting to shop talk, to work conversations. It's just almost like a recording on repeat, and you're always talking about work. Could be, this client issue, this is happening in the workplace. I can't stand my boss. I can't stand the organization I work for. So it could be complaining, or it could be that you're just talking at length about perhaps a new skill you've learnt in your job. So maybe you did a new training and you want to share with your colleague, with your friend's partner, whoever outside of work about the training. That's amazing, but think about the length of time you're talking about it. Are you giving them a 5 to 7 minute summary of the training and how amazing it is and what you're doing differently now that you've got this new knowledge? Or are you giving them a 1 to 2 hour in-depth kind of slide-by-slide detail on the training and talking about this particular client, de-identified, of course, that you're going to now apply this training to? And I guess the reason why I call this one the Storyteller is because stories can often be very long. Think of a chapter book. If you're finding that you're just speaking too much about work, or maybe it's not you, maybe it's your friend or your colleague, maybe they're the ones that are the storyteller in this situation. And then think about those boundaries. I guess the whole reason why we have set work hours is because that's when we're supposed to conceptualize client issues, supposed to think about embedding what we've learned in training into our professional roles. It's not when we're at Friday night drinks or at a family barbecue or at a baby shower or just out to dinner with a group of friends. It's not that's not the time to talk, I guess, at length about the shop talks. That's the second one. The third one is the title holder. That was definitely me in the example of how I introduced myself by my professional title first at my friend's baby shower. So the title holder, it looks a little bit like this. If you hold your sense of worth based around your professional title, so you would be someone who, like me, would lead with your professional title or your professional qualification at even social settings, you would lead with that. That's one thing you would definitely be doing. If you're in between professional roles, or maybe if you're in between jobs, for example, you would feel incredibly lost if you don't have that professional title to fall back on. You're also someone who tends to cling on to the professional title above anything else, and it may even hold you back from applying for different jobs. For the title holder, moving into a job in which you're then back in that learner stage would feel incredibly scary and daunting because you no longer have that title to hold on to. So perhaps your title is, and I'll use a professional title as opposed to a qualification, given that we all have various qualifications. So let's say your title is senior manager, and you become really attached to that title and you've worked really hard for it, and you've found that you're missing the direct client work. You're missing the clinical work. And maybe you've been thinking about for a while moving into a more direct practice, a more clinical role. And that would then involve a change in your title. So perhaps instead of being senior manager, your title would be clinician or behaviour support practitioner, or another title that involves a change. And that would be incredibly difficult for someone who really over-identifies with their title of senior manager, for example. These three types of people who tend to over-identify with their professional role, these are patterns that I've seen both in myself but also in colleagues and also those that I support through my programs as well. And when we're aware of these things, then we can start to do something about it. We can start to explore our identity outside of our professional roles. So I'm big on a reframe. So if we can reframe those three categories of professionals who over-identify with their professional titles, if we can reframe that as, who are you outside of your professional role? Are you a wife, a husband, a partner? Are you a parent, a friend, a sibling, a daughter, a son? We all have professional titles, yes, and we work very hard for these qualifications that we have, and we work really hard to be in the positions that we're in. And by nature, we're often very ambitious people. I'm certainly not discounting any of that, but I'm just encouraging you to think about, what are the other parts of your identity? Who are you outside of that professional role? I would love to hear from you. if you identify as being the always worker, the storyteller, or the title holder. Do you resonate with one more than the other? I would love to hear from you. Hopefully this 2-part career-focused series has been helpful for you. Thanks so much. Bye. Thank you so much for listening to Not Another PD. If today's episode resonated with you, share it with a colleague who could use stronger boundaries, less burnout, and more balance. And don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, keep saying yes less.